Okay, so wow, this next subject. I'm going to try to tread lightly here because both of the parties involved have actually been really nice to me in the past. And this concerns the NonSequitur Show. I've mentioned them repeatedly on the podcast. If you're not familiar, were a podcast slash YouTube channel that's been around for a relatively short period of time, maybe a few years at the most, I think. And over that relatively short period of time, they've been becoming increasingly popular. If I wasn't such a fan of the show, I'd probably be, maybe am, a little jealous. I think I remember when they actually had fewer subscribers than me. I have roughly 6,000 subscribers. They have approximately 30,000, I think. If I'm not mistaken, I may have originally heard about them through friend and listener Matthew Scharnweber. In the early days, they had some really interesting guests on, various professors and scholars. You might be familiar with Digital Hammurabi, Egyptologists, various scientists and thinkers, etc. And that's not meant to be a dig. I think they've continued to have interesting guests on the show. But I remember just really appreciating that early period and finding that content especially intellectually stimulating. And like a lot of people, I enjoyed the seeming chemistry between the two hosts, Kyle and Steve. And I was really surprised when, while watching The Drunken Peasants a couple of nights ago, upon hearing that there was supposedly some kind of ugly drama going on concerning the NonSequitur Show. And Kyle and Steve had appeared together on The Drunken Peasants a number of times, and they always seemed to get along really well. They just kind of let their hair down and joke around with each other and with Billy and Ben, the hosts of The Drunken Peasants. But I guess behind the scenes there was something kind of ugly festering, and it finally came to a head. The drama floodgates just kind of burst open. All around the same time, a live stream discussing the drama aired, as well as a pre show recording that I guess wasn't meant to see the light of day, where things got pretty ugly. So, as I mentioned earlier, both parties, Kyle and Steve, have been really nice to me in the past. I'm not trying to suggest that I know them all that well or that I have a personal relationship with either of them. That's not the case. I've just had quick passing exchanges with them online, but they were really positive. I did some response videos to episodes of their show, and both Kyle and Steve took the time to leave positive messages in the comments section, and Steve was actually good enough to give the show a shout out on Twitter, which was greatly appreciated. And so this is why I'm trying to tread lightly. I contemplated not covering this story at all, but as a fan of the show, I almost feel compelled to talk about it just to help myself process everything. And also, since day one, I've always tried to choose subjects that are both on topic, having something to do with atheism, religion, the so-called atheist or skeptic community, and that also personally interests me. So why not, let's dig in. So as I was saying, all this finally came to a head in a pre-show recording. I say pre-show, but things got so ugly that there ended up not being a show that night. I guess Steve, and to help put things in context, Steve McRae had been around for a while. I believe he is the person behind the Great Debate Community, the founder or creator. So he already had something of a following, and I believe he had already ventured into podcasting. And he still is, friendly with a lot of fairly high-profile online thinkers, philosophers, skeptic types, etc. And it was Steve that provided the NonSequitur Show with a lot of those really interesting and popular guests early on. And as Steve tells it, and yeah, this is what I was kind of saying, he had already had a podcast and he was approached by Kyle Curtis, who wanted to know if he wanted to start up a new podcast with the suggestion that he would take care of the creative aspects, music, graphics, etc. And Steve, with his connections, would provide the guests as well as bringing his own knowledge of philosophy and science to the table. And I guess the understanding from day one is that it would be 50-50, that they would be equal partners. And then over time, problems started to fester. Steve began to have the suspicion that he was slowly being edged out of the picture. Suspicions that were probably somewhat justified in retrospect, seeing as Kyle began to bring all sorts of additional quote-unquote co-hosts on, and he even started experimenting with new show ideas. airing these new fledgling series on the Non-Sequitur channel, like Ad Homies or Ad Homies with Mr. Atheist. And he had another one he hosted with Godless Engineer's wife, I believe. I think her name's KC. And I remember at first thinking that this was a little weird. I was like, where's Steve in the usual format we know and love? What's with these new shows? But Kyle and Steve always seem to get along fairly well on air, so I figured they must have some kind of understanding, or Steve must be cool with it. But seems like this wasn't necessarily the case. Kyle was bringing these new people in that Steve didn't really know, and Steve was beginning to feel shut out. And I guess initially the YouTube channel was Steve's idea. Originally, the show was an audio-only podcast. Steve handed the YouTube channel over to Kyle upon Kyle's request, supposedly so he could handle metrics or search engine optimization, that kind of stuff. I think Steve said it was him also who created the Patreon account, him being Steve. But I guess as of today, Steve's pretty much been shut out of all that stuff and has yet to be paid or see any earnings. And things get a little murky here because supposedly there was some situation where Steve wanted Kyle to hold on to the money and pay him incrementally. There was some reason why Steve had to be careful about how much money he received at once. I thought it was mentioned that it might have something to do with some kind of medical stuff or something. His detractors were trying to imply that he was doing something sketchy or trying to game the system. But as Steve himself explains it, he's a vet and receives VA benefits no matter what, and there was nothing sketchy going on. So he did have a certain way concerning how and when he wanted to receive his payouts, but I guess things started to drag on. Steve was waiting for payments and making requests to see the book, supposedly to no avail. So apparently Steve felt like a conversation about all of this was long overdue, and that Kyle had been avoiding it for weeks. So finally Steve, his friend and reoccurring non-sequitur guest Red's Rhetoric, and their producer, finally kind of penned Kyle in and confronted him in the aforementioned pre-show face-off. And things didn't go so well. Kyle accused Steve of not pulling his weight, of not really contributing all that much, and I'm paraphrasing in fairness. Well, Kyle, provided the graphics and music, etc., and Kyle went as far as to say that it would no longer be a 50-50 arrangement and there would be no more payments in perpetuity, despite their handshake agreement from day one that they would be equal partners or co-owners or whatever. And as you can imagine, this did not go over well with Steve. He's usually pretty laid back or stoic, but that really got his back up, and I don't blame him. If someone I co-founded a podcast or show with suddenly told me that I was no longer entitled to my 50% share and I would no longer be earning money in perpetuity, I would be pretty pissed too. And as a YouTuber myself, one thing that came to mind to me was Google AdSense. Popular videos can go on to earn revenue for years to come. If ads are running on all those old episodes with Steve, isn't he entitled to his fair share of those future earnings? And the Teespring and merch came up, and Kyle tried to claim that since he created or designed the merch, he was entitled to all the money. And it was really funny, but a great point at the same time. Steve just fires back with, "You have my face on a mug." And as something of an artist myself, I can see wanting some kind of compensation for creative work, or maybe feeling because of that work you're entitled to a larger cut of the merch revenue. But the branding on the merchandise still belongs to both of you. It represents a company or an endeavor that you both co-founded and that you're both partners in. So I would say Steve, or the theoretical partner, not actually doing the designing, is still entitled to a slice of the merch pie. And just to put things into context, supposedly the Non-Sequitur Show is making about $4,000 a month. I don't know if that was just Patreon or everything together, but damn, I'm like 4,000. I make about $48 a month. Well, not with my day job, but with the podcast, you know. My day job isn't so great either. What non-existent entity do I have to sell my soul to? 4,000 a month, holy shit. And as I was saying, around this time, there was also a live hangout or stream where Steve, Reds, and some others discussed all this. And there's this woman named Shannon Q who would sometimes appear on the NonSequitur Show. And I heard she was catching a lot of hate on social media, and I was like, really? She's always seemed so nice. What are people so mad about? Then I went and watched that hangout, and holy crap, at some point she comes on, and she's just like in banshee mode right off the bat, raising her voice, being really combative, going on about how she just came from talking to Kyle, and he's very upset. The one thing she said that really rubbed me the wrong way was when she was tearing into Steve and angrily suggesting that she's a co host too, and she doesn't earn anything, acting like Steve is just another minor co host on a rotation and has no reason to be so upset or to expect the compensation he's due. And I'm like, are you fucking kidding me? Do you really not recognize the difference between being a kind of minor guest host on a rotation and being a co founder of a podcast who's supposed to be an equal partner since day one? Give me a break and pardon the F bomb. I had kind of a violent F bomb in the last episode too, which I felt bad about. I think I was venting my frustration about Dave Rubin and having the same guests on. And I don't know, whatever it was I was talking about, it kind of got the better of me, and I ended up dropping a pretty vicious F bomb. But out of respect for Steve, I know he and others want to make sure that people weren't too hard on Shannon Q, so I'll just leave it there. But man, that got under my skin. But I watched the first episode of the NonSequitur show since all this went down. And man, the like to dislike ratio was brutal. I think there were over 900 downvotes, and the comment section was filled with people defending Steve and calling out Kyle. And I guess the channel's lost about 2 or 3,000 subs. But in fairness, all that considered, their sub count is still, it still drastically dwarfs my own. Gotta keep it real. So who knows what will happen now? Only time will tell. I think Steve will continue doing his thing on his own channel and is enjoying a lot of support right now. How will the NonSequitur show fare in the long run? Will it successfully, continue on or rise from the ashes? I don't know. Or will it just serve in memory as a cautionary tale to other content creators? And so I really was a fan of both Kyle and Steve. I loved them both. I loved their chemistry, loved watching the show. But you can probably tell by the way, I'm talking here that my sympathies pretty much lie or lay with Steve here. But as I understand it, Kyle's been going through a lot lately. And while all of this was going down, he was dealing with the stress of waiting for biopsy results. As someone who comes from a family riddled with cancer, I definitely feel for him on that count. And I hope that his test results come back negative, and I wish him good health. That being said, I think it's fair to say that these issues have been festering long before his health concerns arose, and it had to come to a head at some point. And I probably don't need to add that, as cold as it might sound, being struck with a medical condition or ailment, no matter how serious, it doesn't absolve you of wrongdoing or not honoring an agreement. You can have sympathy for the person and wish them well, and yet still be able to say, hey, you did the other guy dirty, and that's not cool. But man, it's just a really messed up situation. And as a fan of the show and someone who liked both these guys, finding out about all of this and watching that, that pre-show recording or whatever, it's just really, really depressing. Wow. And it kind of took me to a place in my past that I'm not, too proud of. I think I'm technically still in a band. We just don't we just don't play anymore. I'm in a band with some of my best friends. But I've been playing music with people since high school. And I can remember being like in high school all the way to maybe a little after high school, where you're still, young, still have a lot to learn, and maybe you're not finished, emotionally maturing, et cetera, although that's not an excuse. And there would be times when tension would form in the band, where maybe people started to think that a certain band member wasn't pulling their weight enough, or maybe someone better could be found. or maybe, you could tell someone was going to leave if another person didn't leave first. And there was also stuff back in the day where, my friends and I had a habit of falling for girls and getting all hung up on these girls, and the girls would get in the way of the band and be all sorts of drama, people getting cheated on, bringing girlfriends into the jam space and stuff like that. And and I remember, I don't really want to get into it, but that was a cause of drama too, that was causing like friction between certain band members. And I just remember, and I take a lot of the blame for this, instead of just manning up and being brutally honest. I say brutally, but that's the wrong word because it should be a positive thing. Just being really forthright and honest about our issues and talking to each other and seeing what we can do to resolve the situation constructively without, hopefully without losing, any friends or bandmates or whatever. Instead, it would always kind of go to kind of scheming behind people's backs. Not that we were trying to be mean to other people, but I think at the time we probably just didn't have the balls or the emotional maturity to just face the person and try to work stuff out. So instead, you tried to find new members, behind the other person's back, or you'd start slowly kind of trying to nudge the other person out the door in kind of, kind of a shitty way. And this all reminds me of that. And, I'm still ashamed of having any part of that kind of thing in my own past. And I've tried to learn from that to be more honest in my dealings with people and to just, if I have issues with people, just be honest but good natured at the same time. And just, try to be honest with the person out of respect for them and try to reach some kind of resolution. Um, so yeah, this just, this whole thing just depresses me, kind of grosses me out, and I don't know what to think about it. And I was going to cover one more story. I was going to cover a story about lesbian ponies. But I feel kind of wiped after all that. I don't really know how to segue. It was a story about a My Little Pony cartoon that features lesbian pony parents or whatever, and right wing Christians getting all bent out of shape about it. But I'm gonna call it a wrap. Thanks for listening, everyone. You know the drill. You can like the Facebook page. You can follow the show on Twitter, although I don't really spend that much time on Twitter. You can check out the YouTube channel. Maybe doing that now. If you want to support the show monetarily, you can go to patreon.com/theweekendoubt and support the show for as little as 99 cents a month. All right, brothers and sisters, until next time.